Alright, hi guys. So for video number 5, we're going to talk about something called the ATP-ADP cycle. Okay, and we've already discussed, we know what ATP is. That's a adenosine with 3 phosphates attached to it. And we know that that becomes ADP when you break off that last phosphate and you release some of that energy. So the cells do that. This occurs all the time within cells because whenever we need energy, we just break off that last phosphate and make ADP. Okay, but now this is where respiration comes into play. So for this diagram, and you have a similar one kind of in your notes at the top of page 4, okay, where it says ATP ADP cycle. And basically what's happening here, so you start with ATP, you need to, ATP, you break off that third phosphate to release energy needed for cellular work. This is metabolism, okay? So basically you take ATP, break off that phosphate, and the energy that's released is used for metabolism, okay? And then basically then as you come down here, what you're left with at that point, you don't have an ATP anymore. Now you have an ADP and this phosphate, okay? Then what occurs is these both go floating back out into the cell, and then cellular respiration occurs, where basically you take the energy from food, you break down that glucose, and when you break those bonds, you release energy. What that energy does is re-adds the phosphate to the ADP to create ATP. Okay, so over here we have metabolism. Then after metabolism, you release that energy when you break off that phosphate. You have ADP and ADP and the third phosphate, and then what happens is these kind of float off separately, and both of these then will hopefully find, hopefully an ADP finds another phosphate, hopefully this phosphate finds another ADP, and when you break down that food, the energy that's released re-adds the phosphate to the ADP. Okay, so that brings us to important terms that I think I forgot on the last video. Phosphorylation versus dephosphorylation. So over here during metabolism, you dephosphorylate ADP. Dephosphorylate means you take off a phosphate group, and then as you swing over here, you now phosphorylate in ADP. Phosphorylate means you add a phosphate group. Okay, so this is basically how respiration works, how respiration and metabolism work. Metabolism breaks off the phosphate and releases energy. So respiration adds the phosphate to the ADP. So therefore, it uses energy from the food in order to do that. So you get this cycle. Okay, and this is kind of the equation that shows it. This process is hydrolysis, just like we talked about before, where water comes in and breaks the bond. So that's what basically breaks off that phosphate group. It's a hydrolysis reaction. So you can see in our equation here, and in the one in your notes there, ATP, basically you bring in a water, you break off that phosphate, what you get is ADP plus a phosphate plus this energy. Okay, so going in this direction, that's metabolism. Okay, going in this direction is respiration, where I take my ADP and my phosphate, I use energy from breaking down the food, and I remake my ATP. Okay, so this direction's metabolism, this direction's respiration. Okay, in the notes, one of the things that I forgot, number 8 there, AMP. You should know what AMP stands for. That would be adenosine monophosphate. Occasionally we can break off this third or the second phosphate on ADP, but normally we don't. Normally we just basically, you never even form AMP. You can, but we're not really going to talk about it much in here in this class, because normally that's not what occurs. Okay, normally you don't make AMP. So again, this direction dephosphorylation occurs, this direction phosphorylation occurs. Dephosphorylation occurs, phosphorylation occurs. Okay, and you get this cycle where you're basically using ATP, creating ATP. Using ATP for metabolism, creating ATP from cellular respiration. Using, creating. Okay, and just as a side note, basically over here the energy from food, if oxygen is present, basically when we break all the bonds of oxygen in order to create ATP molecules, if oxygen is present, it's relatively efficient. Basically the cell's cellular respiration can use 55 to 65% of the energy in glucose. If oxygen is not present, so in anaerobic respiration, then you only use 5% of the energy. So basically, normally you want oxygen to be present. Okay. So I think that's pretty much everything for this section. So please stay tuned for the next video. And this was, again, video number 5, which covers page 4 of the notes. Peace.